Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. I am Gregory Hargreaves, Program Officer in the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. And during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great research being done using collections at the Hagley Library, especially by scholars who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joining me today is Jonathan Robbins, Assistant Professor of History at Michigan Technological University, and we'll be discussing his book titled Oil Palm, A Global History, available now from UNC Press. Jonathan, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Gregory. It's good to be here.
Thank you. Now, why don't you introduce us to your project, Oil Palms Set in a Global Setting? I really enjoyed reading the book. Why don't you sort of set it up for our listeners?
Sure. Well, the book is framed as a history mostly of palm oil, which is the main commodity that comes from the oil palm tree. But I realized it didn't make a lot of sense to tell the story of palm oil as a commodity without really digging into the history of oil palm as a thing, as a plant, and as something that is grown in many different contexts in many different ways around the world. So the history began as a commodity history, but turned into a commodity history plus agricultural history plus environmental history, and it grew rapidly. The scale of it just ballooned as I worked on it, from initially a 20th century history into a 19th century, and at this point I have so substantive chapters going all the way back to the 15th century, which is well outside my area of expertise. But I thought it was important to really contextualize the story of this plant and this commodity that is, I think, still very poorly understood by many people, particularly in the global north, despite the fact that we consume it every day in all sorts of different products.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I did learn so much reading the book. Why don't you sort of give us the narrative arc? It is incredible how you've spanned so much time and so much space. Maybe sort of define the boundaries of your study for us.
Mm-hmm. Well, the story begins really in prehistory, in sort of the earliest interpretations through archaeology as well as oral history of how humans settled Western Africa, which is where the oil palm was originally from. And so I try to give a survey of the latest literature, the latest findings, and I tried to sort of upset, I think, one of the prevailing understandings of agriculture and agricultural history in Western Africa, which is the sense of gradual forest destruction. And I think there's been some really groundbreaking research by scholars using archaeology, paleobotany, other techniques that have really shaken up this view and have really changed our understanding of African agriculture as something that is rooted not in necessarily hacking and burning down rainforests, but in something that is in some ways creating forests and taking advantage of climatic changes. As it turns out, the oil palm is a really important part of that story and a really important marker of human communities moving and bringing agriculture throughout different parts of Western Africa. So I start with this really longue durée view to really pound home this idea that the oil palm is an African crop and has been cultivated in a diverse number of ecological settings, but also cultural settings for thousands and thousands of years. And its history as an important plantation crop, a plantation commodity, is really just a tiny fraction of that history. So having tried to sort of sketch out that groundwork, I follow the oil palm through history and try to figure out where it first shows up in the historical record. And there's unfortunately a really common fact or a supposed fact that pops up all over the internet that claims that palm oil is found in a series of First Dynasty tombs from ancient Egypt about 5,000 years ago. And this was based on some chemical analysis done in the 1890s. And historians picked up on this suggestion from one paper in the 1890s that palm oil turned up in these Egyptian tombs and didn't pay any attention to the follow-ups work in chemical analysis, which conclusively disproved this. And Egyptologists, this is a well-known fact, that palm oil was not found. But this idea that there's this connection between palm oil and ancient Egypt has been incredibly persistent. It shows up in all kinds of literature that just trying to give some historic context for it. And it was rather famously used by the American Palm Olive Soap Company to try to link this commodity that they used, palm oil, with, as they put it, ancient Egyptian beauty secrets. And it's a completely fictional marketing campaign. It has no basis in reality. And so I do a little bit of debunking in these early chapters, trying to figure out where the oil palm does first appear in the historical record. And there are a couple of candidates. There's one, I think, fairly convincing record that shows up in an Arabic language source from the 13th century. But it's really not until Portuguese ships begin making regular contact with the West African coast that we really start to see evidence of oil palm in the written historical record. And I follow the story from there, trying to see how the oil palm plant and palm oil as a commodity spread out of Africa. And it's a very gradual process. And it really doesn't accelerate until the 17th century and the 18th century, when the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, reaches this incredible peak and brings a lot of palm oil and oil palm trees themselves out of Africa and into other parts of the world.
It is remarkable how the story of this species, and it's, well, a series of species actually, isn't it? But how the oil palm spreads as a result of globalization and as a result of both colonialism and capitalism. But before we get to that, perhaps you could describe for us a little bit of the cultural significance of palm oil in West Africa, how it's used and how it intersects with traditional lifeways there.
Well, at a really basic level, it's a vital food. It provides calories in the form of fat. It also has a lot of vitamin A, which is a fat-soluble vitamin. It's in areas where the oil palm is predominant, it's probably the key source of vitamin A in the human diet. So it's an incredibly important foodstuff. It's also used, and I hesitate in the book as well to generalize, because there's the cultural diversity in Western Africa is just mind-boggling. But generally speaking, palm oil is used as a food. It's also used as a cosmetic product, rubbed on as a skin cream or as a hair treatment. It has an enormous range of medicinal uses, mostly for treating skin ailments, but also as a delivery mechanism for herbal cures. It has religious significance in some cultures, associated with certain spirits or deities. For example, in the Yoruba tradition, there's a strong association between palm oil, which is red, and smallpox. So there's a sense that palm oil and other products of the oil palm tree, including palm wine, which is a white sap that naturally ferments into wine, that these colors are important in both physically combating smallpox and spiritually combating it, avoiding the red, offering deities the white, to try to sort of balance out this. And palm oil is used for all sorts of other ritual purposes, anointing newborns shortly after birth, and this is a practice that's carried over and adapts really easily with both Christian and Muslim religious practices, as well as these move into oil palm growing areas of West Africa.
And so then, as the oil palm spreads out of West Africa, what path does it take, or what path did it take, rather?
Well, it literally rides with slave ships, with the slave trade. The first exports of palm oil probably went to Portugal, although there's no clear historical records that we found of that. But by the 1600s, there's really clear evidence that oil palms and palm oil are showing up in the Caribbean. Some of the earliest records from Barbados, for example, show that plantations are buying casks of palm oil for their enslaved workforce as a food probably also as a ritual object or a ceremonial substance. But they're also planting oil palm trees to try to cultivate this African crop in the New World. And it doesn't appear that there's any effort to cultivate it commercially. The main goal seems to be subsistence for enslaved populations and their descendants. And it's about this period, the early 1600s, that oil palm also shows up in Brazil, in the state of Bahia in the Northeast, where it really takes off and really finds a foothold in some of the unique ecology of that area. And it's in this period in the 1600s as well that palm oil starts showing up in North America, in Europe, in England. It goes from something that just doesn't appear at all. The word doesn't even exist in English language books in the 15th and early 16th centuries. And then suddenly it's showing up everywhere. It's showing up in botanical books. It's showing up in herbal books. It's showing up in shopping guides. It's showing up in all sorts of things as a fairly commonplace medicine. And there, I was not able to find a period where it was extremely exotic. It jumps straight into this very mainstream medicinal use very rapidly. And so it wasn't widely used. People weren't consuming large amounts of it on a day-to-day basis in Europe, but it was not at all a rare or exotic substance. There's one great book that recommends rubbing palm oil on the back of your sore horse after a long day's riding. So this is it very quickly becomes an everyday medicinal commodity in Europe, which borrows directly from African medicinal practices, particularly the use of it as skin treatment.
In both of these cases, as food for enslaved workers, as well as a common everyday medicine and consumable, both of these situations bring up or introduce one of your key themes, which is cheapness, the inexpensiveness of this product, which would make it desirable as a means of feeding enslaved workers, as well as help us to understand how it so quickly became such a common day-to-day consumer good in the global north. Perhaps you could build a little bit on cheapness and market price and the role it plays in your story.
Yeah, this is a key point in what I see as the shift from the first part of the book to the second part of the book, which is how palm oil becomes this mass market commodity. This is a 19th century story. And as you mentioned, it is fundamentally about cheapness. In these really early roles for palm oil, its unique qualities are highly valued. Its bright red color, its odor, which is reputed in historical sources to smell like violets. I personally have never gotten a violet smell from palm oil, but sense of smell is a very subjective thing, much like taste.
This color, this floral. I'm sorry to interrupt, but is it perhaps a floral aroma, or how would you describe it?
Are floral notes. I tend to get more vegetally tastes and smells, sort of a pumpkin-y, maybe even carroty kind of flavor. But these qualities had been highly valued when palm oil was used as medicine and as food for enslaved workers in the Americas. But palm oil in the 19th century becomes this mass market commodity, and those qualities within a matter of years lose all of their significance. Palm oil is bleached, it's deodorized, it's used interchangeably with tallow, which is a product that's derived from animal carcasses. And it's used in soap and candles and other things. And palm oil is used as a substitute for tallow solely because it's cheaper. It's the only reason it's widely adopted in these industries is because it's cheaper, and it's cheaper because of the unique ecologies and cultures of production that produce it in Africa. Leveraging really a very bountiful natural environment that makes palm oil abundant, but also social systems that make it relatively cheap to produce vis-a-vis tallow and other commodities. And this is really the story of palm oil into the 20th century. It's used because it's cheap, and it's constantly substituting for other products that had previously been used but are now phased out because they're more expensive.
So in the 19th century, then, is the main global source of palm oil continued to be West Africa?
Absolutely. And the region that is today Nigeria is by far the biggest exporter, the biggest producer. There are pockets all across the Western African coast that export, but southeastern Nigeria becomes by far the biggest exporter, in part because it has this amazing natural environment for oil palm. There's an enormous density of oil palms in the area. And hundreds of years of agricultural practices of shifting cultivation in the region had built up pretty massive stands of oil palm. And there's a massive population in this area that can exploit this crop and produce it for export. Until 1920, West Africa is by far the largest exporter of palm oil in the world market. And Brazil, for example, never becomes a major exporter. Lots of palm oil is produced in Brazil, but it's almost all consumed locally as food or for soap or for other products. And oil palm almost goes extinct in much of the Caribbean. It's not commercialized anywhere, and it disappears from places like Barbados, Demerara. There's some on the larger islands like Cuba and Jamaica. There are pockets that survive, but it does not become a really endemic species in these areas. So West Africa has sort of a natural monopoly until the 20th century on this really important commodity.
That is just fascinating. Then how did that density of this resource in West Africa, perhaps particularly in Nigeria, intersect with colonialism and the 19th into the 20th century scramble for Africa, dividing where European powers divided up the continent amongst themselves, as it were?
Yeah, this is something that I've wrestled with how to present it in the book, and I wound up taking 3 chapters and shrinking them to 1. And I think I risked oversimplifying a lot, but I think a lot of scholars who are not Africanists tend to draw a straight line between the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, the development of commodity trades like palm oil, and colonialism, the scramble for Africa at the end of the 19th century. And it's a lot more complicated than that. There are a lot of intervening steps. And for most of the 19th century, direct colonial control, that is Europeans occupying land, controlling trade, is not how palm oil is produced, and it's not how it's exported. The industry remains almost entirely under the control of African states and African communities who are producing for export because they want to buy things that foreigners have to sell, like cloth, salt, weapons, metal tools and objects. And so I don't want to, characterize this as an era of, free trade. There's a lot of restrictions on trade. There's an enormous reliance on slavery in both the production and the transport of palm oil in Africa. But it's carried out without a lot of the structures that we think of being associated with colonialism. And it's not until the 1880s and 1890s, when the so-called Scramble for Africa kicks off, that we start to see large-scale invasions of African territory and the seizure of African states by European powers. And it's not until really 1900 that these key palm oil producing areas are actually under the control of European colonial powers. And palm oil is not the major draw. Looking across the continent, there are a lot of other more important resources from the perspective of European imperialists, but conflicts over palm oil in places like Nigeria and neighboring countries, these provide the excuses for imperial invasions for powers like Britain and France and Germany. Palm oil happens to be what's there, and that's why it provokes these conflicts.
Well, once European powers have effectively taken territorial control over palm oil producing regions, does that affect the economy of production and distribution of the commodity?
Well, yes and no. The biggest immediate impact is on the actual export trade, on the people who assemble palm oil for export and sell it. And until formal colonization happens, until these wars of conquest happen, the trade had been in the hands of African merchants and African states, and they'd often levied pretty significant taxes on them. They tried to control access to palm oil markets, and a lot of the conflicts among African states were over access to markets and control. And so the arrival of European power knocks a lot of these middlemen out of their position. They lose the ability to extract rent from this trade. They lose the ability to limit the flow of palm oil. And so for producers of palm oil, who are usually pretty far up in the hinterland, who are one or two or three transactions removed from the European ship at the coast that's loading palm oil, for these producers, initially, there's a real boom in trade. There's an opening of exports. And a lot of new entrants join the business. Merchants who had not previously been able to compete in earlier decades could suddenly get a start in the business. But in the long run, there are significant impacts for palm oil producers as colonial states begin to impose taxes. They begin to regulate the oil palm industry, trying to control for quality and crack down on fraud. And these things by the 1920s and 30s are really hitting producers hard because they're bearing the costs of quality control, but they're often not seeing rewards for it in the form of higher prices. So colonialism does have a real impact, but it is to ultimately increase the volume of palm oil produced. I mean, it doesn't actually diminish this trade at all.
Does it change the ultimate destination, the consumer base for the commodity? Is more of it going to Europe once European powers have effectively colonized the region of Africa?
The ratio of palm oil going to Europe certainly increases. More palm oil total is produced, and more of it is made in part because it's easier for rural producers to get it to market, to sell. I don't want to put too happy a gloss on it, but the so-called imperial peace that's brought by these wars of conquest that France and Britain in particular wage do bring significantly increased security to many rural areas. People have less fear of being attacked and robbed or caught up in wars on the way to market. And so more and more people bring their products to market, and they bring it from farther and farther away. Colonial transportation like the railroad and steamship services and even just dirt roads that can be traveled by bicycle bring many millions more people into contact with this export economy. So there's a lot more people who have the chance to sell for export by the first half of the 20th century. So is more of it going to different areas? Europe remains the biggest external consumer, but even by 1950, in a place like Nigeria, Nigerians were consuming domestically probably about as much palm oil as they were exporting. So there's still a massive local demand for palm oil. There's still a huge domestic market. And this is a theme I try to really pound home in the book, is that even as they are servicing this growing world market, African producers are consuming huge amounts of palm oil domestically. And in some colonies, French colonies in particular, Ivory Coast and Benin, for example, local markets consume so much palm oil that there's nothing left to export. Palm kernels, which are the nut at the center of the oil palm fruit, kernels become the major export product because people are using all the palm oil domestically. So there's a lot of variation from region to region. But the European takeovers, I would suggest, happen because European countries were already consuming palm oil. There's not a real redirection of trade that happens as a result.
Well, you sort of open the story for the 21st century reader by mentioning how Southeast Asia is such a large source, particularly from plantation economies growing oil palms. So how did that come to be? To this point, we've been very much focused in West Africa, where the oil palm has, as you say, centuries, even thousands of years of history. How is it now that countries in Southeast Asia are growing so much of this commodity and fulfilling a global appetite for it?
Right. Well, it's a story that really begins with another commodity, rubber. Now, oil palm had been in Southeast Asia since at least 1848, probably earlier, but 1848 is the first documented importation to what was then the Dutch East Indies. And the Dutch experimented with oil palm. The British did as well in the area and gave up on it by the 1870s. It was just not very lucrative. It didn't seem to make any sense. But the success of plantation rubber beginning in the 1890s really radically transforms what is now Indonesia and Malaysia. It attracts huge amounts of European capital. There's massive investment in the region. There's a massive recruitment of indentured labor from southern India, from China, from Java. So this influx of labor and capital in a matter of 2 decades transforms areas that had been thinly populated forests into plantation monocultures, mostly growing rubber. And several of these rubber companies are aware of the value of oil palm. There are a number of experiments on a smaller scale with growing palm oil alongside or as an alternative to rubber. But it's one particular company, well, it's now called Socfin, which is pioneered by a Belgian, Adrien Halle, who had been in Congo. He had worked in the palm oil industry in Congo. He switches to rubber, and then he switches from Congo to Southeast Asia, first Malaya, and then later Sumatra. And from the very beginning, he writes in his own memoirs, he is convinced that oil palm can grow as well or better in Southeast Asia than it can grow in Africa. And so as soon as he gets an opportunity around 1911, he starts planting it on a large scale, and it sets off just a boom. The trade literature is full of some really outlandish claims about how big this industry is going to be. There's a lot of investment that pours into it, a lot of claims that this industry is going to put West Africa out of business in short order. And it initially doesn't happen. The First World War interrupts a lot of these plans. It prevents plantations from getting machinery, for example. But after the First World War, the oil palm industry really takes off because the fortunes of rubber suddenly decline. The price of rubber crashes after the First World War, and plantation companies are looking for something else, and oil palm seems like the next big thing. And so they shift capital, they shift labor into this new sector. And by 1930, the island of Sumatra, which is part of the Dutch East Indies, is exporting as much palm oil as Nigeria. And by 1940, it's exporting more than all of Africa combined. And this is largely down to just how incredibly efficient the plantation system is for producing oil palm, compared with the varied techniques in West Africa, some of which we could fairly call plantation alike, but some of which are really decentralized, mixed in with other kinds of cropping, and which produce a lot of palm oil per labor hour invested, but not a lot per hectare. They're not very efficient on a land basis. And so the Southeast Asian plantations can cram lots of trees into one location. They can put a lot of labor to plant and cultivate and harvest them, and the result is just incredible productivity on a per laborer per hectare basis.
I would imagine also a result would be the standardization of the end product. You mentioned at first how mind-bogglingly diverse palm oil can be and its cultivation is in West Africa, but I would imagine in Southeast Asia, the product coming out of these plantation monocultures is much more standardized. Is that true? And if so, do they select a certain variety of oil palm to suit this purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. And standardization is really the main justification for plantation cultivation. The costs of the early plantations, despite being incredibly efficient, the costs are not very competitive with West African costs into the 1920s and 30s. Where they excel is in quality control. And as a detail, probably at tedious length in the book, palm oil was many different things in Africa. Fresh palm oil is consumed locally. It was by the end of the 19th century often made in a different way than export grade oil, which was allowed to often naturally ferment and become rancid because it was not used for food. It was used for soap and grease and other industrial applications. And so the kinds of palm oil that were coming out of West Africa varied enormously in quality. Some were really fresh, really edible, bright red, bright orange. Some were black and rancid and just incredibly foul smelling, according to the accounts we have. And so the plantations, one of the things they hope to do is to produce that really fresh, top quality oil that can be used in foods like margarine and other food industries. And they hope that by capturing the very top end of the market, they'll be able to be profitable despite the fact that West African production costs are so low. They're hoping to basically eliminate the market for low-end palm oil by flooding the market with this expensive but very high-quality palm oil that can be used in food industries.
Is that part of the story the advent of processed food industries and the tendency of folks to be eating pre-processed, prepackaged foods that is very much a mid-20th century story?
Well, it has its roots in the late 19th century, certainly. The development of the tin can and other sorts of packaging involving tin plate. These things start to bring not just what we think of as tinned foods, your can of peas, but also a box that keeps crackers or cookies fresh for a long time. These things are becoming more and more common in the second half of the 19th century. And by the 1890s, they're pretty much everywhere. And palm oil, of course, plays a role in tin plating. It's a very minor but important role in the industrial process that sticks tin to those iron or steel sheets to protect them from rust. But as these foods spread, as people become accustomed to the ideas of eating packaged foods and eating new foods like margarine, which initially is not at all a very appetizing product for many people, as they become accustomed to it, palm oil finds new roles as a key ingredient in margarine, as a baking fat, for example, in crackers and biscuits and cookies. And it's used mostly in a highly refined state. So it's bleached, it's deodorized, it has no flavor. Consumers would have no idea it was in a product unless manufacturers told them. And this, again, is part of the appeal of palm oil. It can be substituted because it's cheap with tallow, with other vegetable oils, with whale oil even. Whale oil is in margarine alarmingly late into the 20th century. It doesn't fully disappear to the 1960s. And so for the manufacturer's point of view, they can shuffle around whatever's cheapest. And often it is palm oil. Often palm oil is the cheapest thing to substitute in at any given time. But this flexibility really appeals to industrial food manufacturers who are confronting a market where consumers expect a stable product and a stable price over time, but they're buying their raw materials from highly volatile agricultural markets where prices are moving in all sorts of different directions. And so being able to balance these different commodities by interchanging them is a really key feature of the business success of some of these consumer good companies.
Not food only, but anywhere that lipids form part of the equation, as you say, with soaps or other cosmetics, etc. That's just fascinating. Now, what collections at the Hagley Library did you access to help you uncover this story?
Yeah, well, the whole project began with an exploratory grant to look at the Carter Litchfield papers. And Dr. Litchfield was an oil chemist. He was working in the chemical industry, and he had a very diverse range of interests in the history of oil products. And so he collected on everything, on palm oil, on linseed oil, whale oil,
Mhm.
dolphin oil, you name it. If it has something to do with an oil or a fat, he collected it. He had a huge collection of margarine tax stamps as well, and published a whole book on margarine tax stamps. So Carter Litchfield developed this incredible collection of publications, of ephemera, trade cards, advertising, that sort of thing, which he donated to the Hagley. And he also acquired the papers of another chemist, Julius Levkovich, who was probably the foremost oil chemist in the late 19th century, early 20th century. He died in, I think, 1913, 1914. And Levkovich was one of the pioneers in developing standards for testing different oil products, for evaluating what was in something like margarine. What chemical tests could you use to tell the difference between tallow or palm oil? He developed a lot of these tests. He built up a very successful commercial business, oil testing. And he also found investors for a company that was trying to convert palm oil as it was cheaply available from West Africa, which is to say rancid, not very nice looking, certainly horrific tasting, trying to convert it into something edible, trying to take this very cheap but very low value substance and then turn it into a higher value product. And his papers are not as complete as we'd like, but it seems that it mostly worked. He was able to use different refining techniques and hydrogenation to turn this really inedible stuff into something that resembled cocoa butter. He got some chocolate companies to use it, and they apparently liked it. And so this is the collection that got me started. Just all sorts of materials on palm oil, but also on different other fats and oils. And I initially wasn't sure I was going to be writing a book about palm oil. But in trying to sort of tell the story of Julius Levkovich and his work, I sort of got a much bigger appreciation for the role of palm oil in the industrial food system of the 20th century. And this spiraled into this deeper quest to see, well, where does palm oil as a commodity come from? And so that was the key collection, this Carter Litchfield collection. But of course, Hagley has an amazing collection of other ephemera, trade cards, trade publications, some of which are digitized. So I consulted a lot of these in person during an amazing 2-week visit, and then have come back every year to use the online collections, which are just an incredible wealth of resources for understanding. In the case of palm oil, particularly for understanding where palm oil wasn't important. And this is something that it's hard to convey in a book. The story that I'm not telling. But one of the things that really informed the writing of the book was seeing how palm oil compared with things like cottonseed oil and later soybean oil. And one of the things that I really appreciated, that I really learned from browsing, in this case, trade periodicals, was the sense that palm oil wasn't all that important. It's not the commodity that makes or breaks the industrial world. It's never the most important commodity in any industry. And so understanding its changing roles and sometimes niche roles was something that I think I couldn't have gotten without looking at all of these diverse trade publications in all kinds of industries: soap, candles, paint, food, iron and steel for tin plating and cold rolling steel. Just so many different uses across so many different sectors that would be hard to find in a single archive anywhere else in the world. So that was, just an incredible, from the researcher's point of view, just an incredible resource, is having all these materials in one place at the Hagley.
And the unique position of the commodity allowed you to tell a really unique and fascinating story. And I so enjoyed reading the book, and I so appreciate you speaking with me about it today.
Oh, well, thank you. And I'm glad you enjoyed it. And I hope to certainly be back at the Hagley soon.
Oh, yeah. Well, we look forward to seeing you. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society, and the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. Visit hagley.org. That's hagley.org. And don't be a stranger.